Right, so the author's anonymous. Much of Middle English literature is written in a broad range from the aristocracy, in terms of class, from the aristocracy all the way down to the lower classes. Unlike Old English literature, which is mostly about noble people and the lords and all that stuff which you read last week, Middle English often uses the vernacular, and the vernacular is everyday speech. Latin was still used as the language of the learned and the language of the church. What else do I want you to know? If you're familiar with Arthurian legend, that comes from this period, this Middle English period. The romance that we are reading, Sir Orfeo, it's called a Breton lay, and many of these poems are about romance. They have a supernatural element to them, so if you read through, you will notice fairies and the underworld, and so there are all these sort of Celtic cultural artifacts that had come from an earlier time, and they're sort of in these poems. So the poem also is based on the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. So you might want to read up on that backstory. So it's a retelling of that in a narrative romance. There's a tree that the Queen Herodes sits under, and it's called the Impa tree, and this tree is often associated with sinister things. And fairies in Middle English, unlike fairies today, were more sinister. So the king of the fairies, takes Herodes to the underworld, and it is up to the king, Sir Orfeo or Orpheus, to rescue his beloved. And he does this through a number of things in his adventure, but the most important thing is that he, like Orpheus, is a great musician, and he's a harper. So it is his musical talents that ultimately save her. And it's also important to note that this poem has a happy ending, which is very different from the Greek myth, which is more somber and sinister and sad. This genre, this romance genre, these long narrative poems were written anonymously, and they were stories for entertainment. So I did include a critical text by Zumthor about Zumthor's mouvance. And this is a theory that basically talks about the way that texts were, because the authors were anonymous, they were changed according to the region that they were told. So it's important to note that there was flexibility in these medieval texts, and that they weren't sort of set in stone. The way, say, if I wrote a poem, I'd want my audience to hear the exact poem that I wrote because I'm the author, Sandra Simons. I want it to be exactly the case. This is different for these poems because they did not have an author, and often they had many authors, and many people say, I got Sir Orfeo and I lived in California, and the text originated in Maine. I could sort of change it to add surfers or whatever was in my cultural context. So, or maybe some Southern California things into it. I'm just using that example to show you that that's what mouvance is talking about, is that flexibility of the text, because there is no author, or there are multiple authors, but they are all anonymous and unnamed. There, of course, were religious texts. We're not going to read those for this period, but they were important as well to this time period. But I chose this romance because I think it's a really fun read, and it's also it's sort of sweet. So that's it.